In the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Florence, where daggers gleamed as readily as gold coins, a man sat in his modest study, quill scratching against parchment with the determination of one who had witnessed empires rise and fall. Niccolò Machiavelli, exiled from the very political machinery he had once served, understood a truth that would echo through centuries: those who beg for power never truly possess it, while those who calculate and command it become untouchable. The morning sun cast long shadows through the narrow windows of his villa as Machiavelli reflected on the countless souls he had observed groveling before princes, merchants pleading with creditors, and nobles prostrating themselves before more powerful lords. Each act of supplication, he realized, was not merely a moment of weakness, it was the forfeiture of one's sovereignty, the surrender of the very essence that separates the ruler from the ruled. Fortune, he murmured to himself, favors the bold, but she destroys the desperate. The words would later find their way into his political philosophy, but, on this particular morning, they served as the foundation for a darker truth. In a world where perception shapes reality, the act of begging transforms the supplicant into prey, forever marked as vulnerable in the eyes of both allies and enemies. The marketplace of Florence buzzed with activity as merchants hawked their wares, each transaction a microcosm of power dynamics that Machiavelli had studied obsessively. He watched as a silk trader, once prosperous, approached potential customers with increasingly desperate offers, his voice rising in pitch with each rejection. The man's posture told the complete story: shoulders hunched, eyes darting, hands gesticulating wildly in an attempt to convince anyone within earshot of his merchandise's value. This scene crystallized what Machiavelli had long suspected: desperation was not merely an emotion but a strategic cancer that consumed one's ability to negotiate from strength. The silk trader, in his eagerness to make any sale, had inadvertently signaled to every potential customer that his goods were worth less than their asking price, that he was willing to accept whatever scraps they might offer. The philosophy that would later influence leaders and tyrants across continents began to take shape in these observations. Machiavelli understood that power was not simply about physical strength or wealth, though these certainly mattered. True power resided in the ability to make others believe you possessed options they did not, that you could walk away from any negotiation without consequence, that your needs were secondary to your strategic objectives. He recalled his years serving Cesare Borgia, watching the young Duke command loyalty not through generosity alone, but through a calculated combination of fear and respect. Borgia never pleaded with his subordinates; instead, he created circumstances where serving him appeared to be their only rational choice. When he required something from allies, he framed requests as opportunities for them to demonstrate their wisdom rather than as favors to him. The distinction was crucial. When one begs, they position themselves as the beneficiary of another's kindness, immediately establishing a hierarchy where they occupy the lower rung. When one calculates, they present scenarios where cooperation serves mutual interests, maintaining the illusion or reality of equal footing. Walking through the narrow streets where Dante once wandered, Machiavelli considered the broader implications of this principle. Every great leader he had studied, from Caesar to his contemporary Borgia, possessed an almost supernatural ability to mask their needs behind strategic presentations. They understood that revealing desperation was equivalent to handing weapons to their enemies. The art of appearing untouchable, he realized, was not about actual invulnerability but about controlling information flow. The moment others perceived your weaknesses, your dependencies, your fears, they gained leverage that could be used against you indefinitely. This was why Borgia had been so effective despite his relatively modest resources. He had mastered the appearance of having alternatives, of being willing to embrace conflict rather than compromise from weakness. As evening approached and the merchants began closing their stalls, Machiavelli observed the silk trader counting his meager earnings. The man's desperation had indeed made sales, but at prices so reduced that each transaction moved him closer to bankruptcy rather than prosperity. This, Machiavelli understood, was the ultimate irony of supplication: it often achieved short-term goals while destroying long-term positioning. The calculated individual, by contrast, might make fewer immediate deals but preserve their ability to negotiate favorable terms in future encounters. They understood that sometimes walking away from opportunities today created better opportunities tomorrow. This patience, this willingness to endure short-term discomfort for long-term advantage, separated those who merely survived from those who truly thrived. In his private notes that evening, Machiavelli sketched the framework that would guide his understanding of power dynamics for the remainder of his career. The desperate individual, he wrote, moved through the world as a beggar, constantly seeking permission, validation, and assistance from others. Their identity became tied to their ability to elicit sympathy or generosity, making them perpetually dependent on the goodwill of those around them. The calculated individual operated from an entirely different paradigm. They approached interactions as strategic encounters where information, timing, and positioning determined outcomes. They understood that true power came not from getting what they wanted immediately, but from structuring situations so that others naturally gravitated toward providing what they needed. This distinction would prove prophetic as Machiavelli watched various political figures rise and fall over the following years. Those who approached challenges with desperation, pleading with foreign powers for assistance, begging their own citizens for loyalty, supplicating before the church for legitimacy, invariably found themselves at the mercy of external forces. Their fate was determined not by their own strategic choices but by the whims and interests of those whose favor they had sought. Meanwhile, leaders who maintained calculated composure, who appeared willing to accept conflict rather than compromise their core interests, often found that others sought to avoid confrontation with them entirely. Their apparent willingness to embrace uncertainty made them unpredictable, and unpredictable actors command respect in ways that desperate ones never can. The transformation from desperate to calculated, Machiavelli understood, required more than simply changing one's behavior in negotiation rooms. It demanded a fundamental restructuring of how one viewed themselves in relation to the world. The desperate individual saw themselves as fundamentally lacking in resources, in power, in legitimacy, and sought to fill these gaps through external validation. The calculated individual recognized that perception often mattered more than reality, and focused on crafting perceptions that served their strategic objectives. Part 2, The Architecture of Calculated Power. As winter settled over Florence, Machiavelli found himself contemplating the nature of untouchability, not the literal impossibility of being harmed, which no mortal could achieve, but the perception of being too costly to attack, too valuable to alienate, too unpredictable to control. This quality, he observed, was not inherited or gifted but constructed through deliberate choices and strategic positioning. The foundation of calculated power, he realized while watching the political maneuverings of various noble families, rested on three pillars: information asymmetry, optionality, and emotional detachment. Each pillar reinforced the others, creating a structure that appeared formidable to outsiders while providing genuine strategic advantages to those who mastered their construction. Information asymmetry meant ensuring that others knew less about your true situation than you knew about theirs. Machiavelli had witnessed this principle in action during his diplomatic missions, watching seasoned negotiators reveal just enough truth to appear honest while concealing the information that would compromise their position. The silk trader who had desperately hawked his wares had violated this principle completely, allowing every potential customer to understand his financial pressures and timeline constraints. The calculated individual, by contrast, approached every interaction as an intelligence-gathering operation. They asked questions that revealed others' needs, constraints, and decision-making processes while sharing information about themselves only when it served strategic purposes. This did not mean lying. Outright deception was often counterproductive, but rather understanding that truth-telling could be selective and strategic. During one memorable evening at a gathering of Florentine intellectuals, Machiavelli observed a merchant who had mastered this principle expertly. When questioned about his business prospects, the man discussed general market conditions, industry trends, and philosophical approaches to commerce without revealing anything specific about his own financial situation, inventory levels, or time pressures. Potential partners left the conversation impressed by his knowledge and insight while knowing virtually nothing that could be used to exploit him. Optionality, the second pillar, meant cultivating alternatives in every significant area of life. Machiavelli understood that desperation arose primarily from the perception of having no choices, of being trapped in circumstances beyond one's control. The individual who possessed or appeared to possess multiple options for achieving their objectives could never be easily cornered or exploited. This principle extended far beyond business transactions. In personal relationships, professional arrangements, and political alliances, the calculated individual maintained multiple pathways to their goals. They invested in diverse relationships, developed various skills, and created redundant systems that prevented any single point of failure from destroying their position. Machiavelli had seen Borgia implement this principle masterfully in his military campaigns. Rather than relying solely on mercenary armies, which could be bought by enemies, or citizen militias, which might lack professional competence, Borjo had developed hybrid forces that combined professional soldiers with local supporters. This approach meant that even if one element of his military power was compromised, he retained the ability to project force and defend his territories. The same logic applied to financial resources, social connections, and sources of information. The calculated individual never allowed themselves to become completely dependent on any single income stream, relationship, or intelligence network. This diversification required constant investment and maintenance, but it provided the psychological security and practical flexibility that made untouchability possible. Emotional detachment, the third pillar, perhaps required the most sophisticated understanding of human psychology. This did not mean becoming cold or unfeeling, but rather developing the ability to separate emotional reactions from strategic decision-making. Machiavelli had observed that desperate individuals often made poor choices because their decisions were driven by immediate emotional needs rather than long-term strategic objectives. The merchant begging for sales had allowed his fear of bankruptcy to override his understanding of market dynamics, accepting prices that guaranteed future problems rather than facing temporary discomfort. The calculated individual would have recognized that maintaining price discipline, even at the cost of immediate sales, preserved their long-term ability to command fair value for their goods. This principle proved especially challenging in personal relationships, where emotional connections naturally created vulnerabilities. Machiavelli understood that caring deeply about others' opinions, approval, or affection could easily transform into dependence that others might exploit. The solution was not to cease caring, but to develop multiple sources of emotional fulfillment and to avoid allowing any single relationship to determine one's sense of self-worth or strategic direction. During his exile, Machiavelli had ample opportunity to practice these principles personally. Stripped of his official position and facing financial hardship, he could have easily fallen into patterns of supplication, begging former colleagues for assistance or prostrating himself before new political leaders for forgiveness. Instead, he chose to maintain his intellectual independence, continuing to analyze political developments and record his observations without regard for whether they pleased potential patrons. This decision, while initially costly, ultimately proved strategically sound. By refusing to compromise his analytical integrity for immediate benefits, Machiavelli preserved his reputation as a clear-thinking observer of political realities. When political circumstances eventually shifted, this reputation proved more valuable than any temporary favor he might have gained through supplication. The construction of calculated power also required understanding the psychology of those one encountered. Most individuals, Machiavelli observed, were themselves driven by insecurities and desires that could be understood and influenced without resorting to direct confrontation or supplication. The calculated individual studied these patterns, developing intuitive understanding of what motivated different personality types and how to present proposals in ways that aligned with others' self-interest. This approach differed fundamentally from manipulation, which typically involved deceiving others about one's intentions or capabilities. Instead, it meant understanding others well enough to structure genuine win-win scenarios, to find ways that helping achieve one's objectives also served the legitimate interests of those whose cooperation was needed. The merchant who had impressed Machiavelli at the intellectual gathering demonstrated this principle throughout the evening. Rather than attempting to convince others to purchase his goods directly, he engaged in conversations about their interests, challenges, and objectives. When commercial opportunities arose naturally from these discussions, they felt like mutual discoveries rather than sales pitches, creating relationships that would likely prove durable and profitable over time. As winter deepened and Machiavelli spent long evenings analyzing the political developments throughout Italy, he recognized that calculated power was not a destination but a practice. It required constant vigilance, continuous learning, and regular adjustment as circumstances evolved. The individual who mastered these principles did not achieve permanent security. Such a thing was impossible in a world of changing alliances and emerging threats, but they did achieve something perhaps more valuable: the ability to navigate uncertainty with confidence and dignity. Part 3, The Untouchable Mind Spring returned to Florence with the subtle persistence of political change, and Machiavelli found himself observing how different individuals responded to the shifting currents of power and opportunity. In these observations, he began to understand that untouchability was not merely about external positioning but about cultivating a particular state of mind that remained stable regardless of external circumstances. The untouchable mind, he realized during long walks through the countryside surrounding his villa, possessed qualities that could not be easily shaken by temporary setbacks, social pressure, or changing fortunes. This mental fortitude was not innate but could be developed through deliberate practice and philosophical understanding. It represented the culmination of the journey from desperation through calculation to true strategic mastery. At its core, the untouchable mind operated from abundance rather than scarcity. This did not mean possessing unlimited resources. Machiavelli himself faced significant financial constraints during his exile, but rather approaching situations with the fundamental belief that opportunities, relationships, and solutions were potentially infinite rather than strictly limited. This perspective shift transformed how one evaluated risks, negotiations, and strategic choices. The desperate individual approached each opportunity as potentially their last, creating urgency that often led to poor decision-making and unfavorable agreements. They saw the world as a zero-sum competition where others' gains necessarily meant their losses, leading to defensive thinking and reactive strategies. The untouchable mind, by contrast, recognized that value could be created through intelligent collaboration, that today's opponent might be tomorrow's ally, and that patient strategic thinking often revealed possibilities invisible to those operating from desperation. During one of his regular visits to Florence's markets, Machiavelli encountered the silk trader he had observed months earlier, but the man had undergone a remarkable transformation. Rather than desperately pushing his remaining inventory, he had begun specializing in rare fabrics for specific clientele, taking orders in advance and commanding premium prices. The change was not merely in his business model but in his entire demeanor. He moved with confidence, spoke with authority, and negotiated as an equal rather than a supplicant. Intrigued, Machiavelli engaged the merchant in conversation and discovered that the transformation had begun with a fundamental shift in perspective. Rather than seeing his financial pressures as emergencies requiring immediate solutions, the merchant had begun viewing them as information about market conditions that could guide strategic adjustments. Instead of trying to force sales of unpopular merchandise, he had studied customer preferences and aligned his offerings with genuine market demand. This example illuminated what Machiavelli would later recognize as a crucial characteristic of the untouchable mind: the ability to reframe challenges as information rather than threats. Desperate individuals typically interpreted setbacks as evidence of their own inadequacy or proof that their situation was hopeless. The untouchable mind processed the same events as data points that could inform better strategies, as feedback that could guide course corrections, as temporary obstacles rather than permanent limitations. The mental discipline required for this reframing was considerable. It meant developing emotional regulation techniques that prevented fear, anger, or disappointment from clouding strategic judgment. It required cultivating patience that allowed for long-term thinking even when facing short-term pressures. Most fundamentally, it demanded building an identity that was not dependent on external validation or immediate results. Machiavelli had observed this quality in Borgia during their interactions, noting how the young duke remained composed and analytical even when facing military setbacks or political betrayals. Borgia's ability to treat disasters as temporary inconveniences rather than existential threats had allowed him to respond with calculated countermoves rather than desperate reactions. This composure had not gone unnoticed by his enemies, many of whom had preferred to avoid direct confrontation with someone who appeared genuinely indifferent to threats. The cultivation of indifference, not to outcomes, which would lead to passivity, but to the emotional charge surrounding outcomes, emerged as perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the untouchable mind. This meant caring deeply about strategic objectives while remaining detached from specific pathways to achieving them. It meant investing full effort in chosen courses of action while maintaining the psychological flexibility to change direction when circumstances warranted. This balance between engagement and detachment proved especially crucial in interpersonal relationships. The untouchable mind could form genuine connections with others while avoiding the neediness that transformed relationships into dependencies. It could appreciate others' approval without requiring it, could offer loyalty without becoming subservient, could maintain friendships without compromising strategic independence. As summer approached and Machiavelli's correspondence with various political figures expanded, he began testing these principles in his own communications. Rather than pleading for reinstatement or defending his past actions, he offered analysis and insights that demonstrated his continued value as a strategic thinker. He approached potential patrons not as a desperate exile seeking charity but as an intellectual resource that might prove useful to their endeavors. The response was markedly different from what he had expected. Several influential figures began seeking his perspective on political developments, not from sympathy but from genuine respect for his analytical capabilities. By refusing to position himself as a supplicant, he had created space for others to see him as a peer whose insights were worth considering on their merits. This experience reinforced Machiavelli's understanding that the untouchable mind operated on principles that seemed paradoxical but proved practically effective. By caring less about immediate approval, one often gained more lasting respect. By appearing willing to accept conflict rather than compromise core principles, one often found that others preferred to avoid confrontation entirely. By maintaining emotional equilibrium regardless of external pressures, one became someone others could rely upon in uncertain circumstances. The untouchable mind also developed what Machiavelli termed strategic patience, the ability to work toward long-term objectives without being distracted by short-term fluctuations in fortune. This quality distinguished those who built lasting influence from those who achieved temporary success but lacked the foundation for sustained power. During conversations with merchants, nobles, and intellectuals throughout the region, Machiavelli noticed that those who possessed real influence often shared this characteristic. They could discuss setbacks without apparent distress, could acknowledge mistakes without defensive justification, could adapt their tactics without abandoning their broader strategic vision. Their consistency across varying circumstances made them predictable allies and formidable opponents. The development of such mental discipline was not a natural process but required conscious effort and continuous practice. Machiavelli began developing exercises for himself, deliberately exposing himself to minor rejections and disappointments to build emotional resilience, practicing negotiation scenarios where he walked away from apparently beneficial deals that required compromising core principles, engaging in intellectual debates where he defended unpopular positions to develop independence from social approval. These practices gradually created what felt like psychological armor, not making him insensitive to feedback or indifferent to relationships, but providing stable confidence that was not easily shaken by external events. This stability, he realized, was what made certain individuals appear untouchable to others. It was not that they could not be harmed, but that they could not be easily manipulated, intimidated, or controlled. As autumn returned to Tuscany and Machiavelli reflected on the year's observations and experiments, he understood that he had identified something profound about human psychology and power dynamics. The journey from desperation through calculation to untouchability was not merely about changing tactics or developing skills, but about fundamentally transforming one's relationship with uncertainty, conflict, and the opinions of others. The untouchable mind operated from a foundation of self-respect that did not require external validation, strategic thinking that was not clouded by emotional reactivity, and long-term vision that was not derailed by temporary setbacks. These qualities could be developed by anyone willing to invest the necessary effort in psychological development and strategic thinking, but they required abandoning the comfortable illusion that others were responsible for one's circumstances or that supplication was a viable long-term strategy. In his final observations, Machiavelli noted that the transformation was rarely complete or permanent. Even the most sophisticated strategists occasionally fell into patterns of desperation when facing unprecedented challenges or personal crises. The difference was that those who had developed untouchable minds recognized these lapses quickly and possessed the tools to restore their strategic equilibrium before making decisions they would later regret. The true measure of untouchability, he concluded, was not the absence of vulnerability but the presence of resilience, the ability to face whatever circumstances arose with dignity, intelligence, and strategic composure. This quality, once developed, became a source of genuine confidence that others could sense and respect, creating the very invulnerability that desperation had always sought but could never achieve. As winter settled once again over the Tuscan landscape, Machiavelli put down his quill with the satisfaction of having captured truths that would remain relevant as long as humans gathered in societies and competed for resources, influence, and respect. The principles he had observed and articulated would guide princes and merchants, diplomats and generals, anyone who understood that true power came not from what others gave them but from what they made impossible for others to take away. The transformation from beggar to strategist to untouchable force was available to anyone willing to abandon the comfortable illusions of supplication for the demanding realities of strategic thinking. It required courage to face uncertainty without seeking immediate rescue, patience to build capabilities rather than seeking quick fixes, and wisdom to understand that real security came not from avoiding all risks but from developing the capacity to navigate whatever challenges might arise. In the end, Machiavelli understood, becoming untouchable was not about achieving a particular position or accumulating specific resources. It was about developing a way of thinking and being that remained effective regardless of external circumstances, that commanded respect from allies and enemies alike, and that provided genuine freedom to pursue one's chosen objectives without being at the mercy of others' whims or approval. The habit of begging, he realized, was ultimately a habit of mind, a way of seeing oneself as fundamentally lacking and dependent on others' generosity or permission. Breaking this habit meant developing the opposite mindset, seeing oneself as fundamentally capable and responsible for creating the circumstances needed to achieve one's objectives. This transformation was perhaps the most valuable gift one could give oneself, and the most dangerous capability one could develop in the eyes of those who preferred dealing with supplicants rather than equals. As the candle burned low in his study and shadows danced across the manuscript pages, Machiavelli smiled with the knowledge that he had captured something timeless and universally applicable. The specific political circumstances of Renaissance Italy would pass, but the fundamental dynamics between desperation and calculation, between supplication and strategic thinking, between vulnerability and untouchability, would remain relevant as long as humans possessed ambition, faced scarcity, and sought to influence one another's behavior. The document he had created was more than political theory or practical advice. It was a map for psychological transformation, a guide for anyone seeking to move from a position of weakness and dependence to one of strength and autonomy. The journey was neither easy nor guaranteed, but for those willing to undertake it seriously, the destination offered something that no amount of begging could ever provide: the respect that came from being genuinely formidable, and the freedom that came from being truly untouchable.